So in this video you're going to create a strapless bodice, a boned strapless bodice. So this will be the end result. There's going to be lined with a contrast fabric so that you can see all the steps. So I now have all of my pattern pieces lined up and I've cut them already. So I've pinned and cut out all of these. This is the outside, and up here I have all the lining pieces cut. I've also cut out fusing. So I've chosen a lighter weight fusing. So fusing should always be, slightly lighter weight than your fabric. It certainly shouldn't be more heavy weight. So in this one, so as well as that, I've snipped all the way around and all the little snips. You could tailor tack alternatively if you prefer, but I have just chosen to do snips. Remember to keep them small, and this is silk dupion, so it frays very easily. Just going to take off the pins, and then when you are going to do the fusing, you want to be careful. You want to be sure you have the two opposite pieces, okay, because you can easily fuse this side and then you'll have the two same side pieces. So you've got to always work with opposites. So each time you're doing something, go slowly and carefully. I'm saying that the inside of all the pieces I cut is the right side. So I'm opening it out and I'm using the fusing, sorry. I'm going to place the fusing, and then I've got to be sure that the fusings are the right way around to match the garment. So there's a glue side is there, I can feel it. So I can put that there and I can put that underneath. And now I know, right, I'm set up with two opposites and the fusing is face down with the glue facing the fabric. So you can also use an alternative method where you fuse a large section of your fabric first and then put all your pattern pieces down and cut them out so that they are all already fused, and you can see that method in Karen's video that's on boning. I think it's called boning a corset if you want to see that method. I tend to just, if I'm just doing a once off, I'll just do something like this. I wait till I get to the time when I'm about to fuse it and I just trim off. If they're squarish pieces, you can usually trim off one side and the other and balance it out, and it works out. And so then I'm going to fuse, put my piece of paper underneath and a piece of paper on top, and just hold the iron pressing down on it for a few minutes all the way along until it is nicely stuck. Okay, and it just gives a little more body to our fabric. Okay, so I now have all of the pieces fused and I'm going to just lay them out ready for sewing. So the next step is to sew them up, and the best thing to do is lay them out in the way that you're going to sew them so you don't get mixed up. So this is the front panel here. Here's the side front, so center front, side front. So we need to have two opposite ones. So when you place them together like that, then you know which way they're sewing. This is the center and this is the sides, and you can kind of see the dart shaping there in the excess space. And I'm just going to scoot that over and show that I'm then going to line up my next piece here. So again, I'm going to line up one on this side and one on the opposite side, which will be out of the frame of this video. But again, just to be sure they're lined up, the two opposites. So you can always check then the notches. So I know I've got my single notch here and here, so that's definitely, I've got my notch to say that's the direction up, so you can check that. And again, I'm going to continue on with this final piece here, which is the center back piece. And again, one on this side and one on the other side. So it takes up quite a lot of table space, but it's worth it to lay them all out so that you don't get mixed up. Like that, from one side all the way over to the other. So I'm ready to go now with my sewing. So the first thing you want to do before you sew anything is always to do a test of the seam. So you want to take a scrap of this silk and do a little seam on it just to test the tension in the machine, the needle and everything. This being silk, I'm going to use a ballpoint needle, size 70 I think, is for fine fabric. So I've done my tension test, or I've done a little seam here, and so the 70 needle is good. There is a tiny bit of tension in this. If you can see, if I pull it, it sort of sits a little straighter. If I let go, I don't know if you can see the slight wrinkles. It's quite subtle, but I shouldn't have to pull my seam for the tension to sit right. It means that there's just a little bit too much tension. So I'm going to just loosen the tension dial a little bit. Also, just doing a test on the iron, and the temperature should be lowish because it's quite thin fabric. So when I'm ready now to sew up, I'm just going to take one side. So I'm going to start, say, at the front and the center front, and sort of work my way out one direction and then another. So I'm going to place this, so they have to be right side to right side. So I'm going to place this together, and you can see then you'll have to pull the fabric to match. This is where all your little snips for your seam allowance matter, because you find your snips and you line them up. So I've pinned that notch there, and now I have to pull these two together to pin there. So all of a sudden now it's going into my three-dimensional shape. So again, my seam allowance notches, I don't want to have them out, you have them lined up, and then you know you're correct. Pin in like that. And so these two, I'll just need to put a little more pins there, and then along here. So it does go three-dimensional once you start to pin. And so then I'm just going to sew, and I'll do the same on the other side. So I have my first seam ready to go. I'm just going to, it's all pinned, and I'm just going to stitch along. Get my notches there, and be sure to place that right in at the needle. And I'm going to stitch along, and just take care that there's no tucking underneath or any fabric catching. Just maneuvering my hand and side on the underneath fabric, because it's, I can tell they're sliding out of place, and it's so, they're going in such different directions, the fabric's so slippy that I'm having to kind of use my hand on the inside to kind of get it to cooperate. So you can see it pulling out here, and I'm kind of pulling that in with this hand underneath to get it to match. And I can also feel a tuck arriving just here, so I'm kind of pulling it in and flattening it out. So it's hard to see what I'm doing in the video, but just this is the most tricky part of sewing the bodice, because it's the steep curve of the bust. Okay, so that's the worst of it over with. So there is my seam stitched, and on the back without any tucks, hopefully, and you can see that that will sit out in the three-dimensional shape of the bust. I'll just need to press that out nicely. press the seam open, and I'm going to turn it around, so don't be tempted to take out bulk, which I know usually would be the case, is when you turn this around it's a little bit bulky, and we might usually take triangles out, but in this case we're going to be sewing boning in, so we need to leave the seam allowance there, and as is for the moment anyway. And you can see that it's starting to get to look a little bit more like it's sewn together. I think I could do a little more pressing, so it's always good to check from the outside. Yeah, it still kind of looks like it's rolling in there and there. Okay, so I'm just going to show a little bit about pressing, because you might be at home without a tailor's ham. So tailor's ham is a shaped kind of, it's almost like a little cushion, and you can place curved shapes on top of it, so it's a piece that you can place under, and you can press the seam out. So I don't have one of those at the moment, so I'm going to show you how you can press without one. So what you don't want to do, I suppose, is take your curved seam, which is coming up, and try and open it and just press the iron flat, because it will crease everything down. It is curved. And so if you have a sleeve board, it's great, because you can go on the edge of it like this and open. Another thing you want to be careful of anyway is just if this bit is flat, so I could press it, but if I go really, really hard down like that, it sometimes makes a little impression, and on the outside you can see this little indent. Very hard to get rid of it, so particularly on these fine fabrics. So just, I always like to, really what we're trying to press is that little section there. You can see it's kind of curving in, and on this fabric, because there's a kind of a sheen on it, it sort of exaggerates it. You can really see it. So I'm just pressing with the nose of the iron, and I'm just hitting this sort of section, so I'm not pressing that edge hard against this. Okay, and I'm going to inch along just a really small bit at a time, but this curved edge of the sleeve board matches the curve a little bit of the bodice, so I can just press there and then inch along. Now I'm only pressing a small piece because it doesn't match it exactly, so I can only ever get a little small bit, and I'm pulling the fabric down to be sure there's no tuck under it, gently, without kind of grabbing and creasing anything. So one of the other things you want to be really careful of when you're pressing is not to crease all the other part of the garment. So that's why I'm press as I go and only ever do a small bit and then press, rather than sewing up the whole garment and then trying to press it, because you'd be getting the rest of the garment crumpled. Okay, so I'm taking my time, as you can see, to arrange just for this little bit. It's the real pointy bit of the bust, and I really want to just press there. I'm not using steam because this is silk, so I've taken all the water out of the iron, but you know, you might use steam on other fabrics. Okay, and I am literally pressing small bits at a time for that steep curve. Again, kind of pulling this down to be sure there isn't any tuck underneath, because if there is, I've gotten it before, it once it gets pressed, it really remembers it, especially this fabric, so you want to be really careful. Okay, now this bit is straight, so I can maybe come back, but also just show you that you can come along the edge of the sleeve board even for the straight bits, and again pull slightly gently to open out the seam, and I'm going to press along the seam, and again this makes sure that I'm not pressing down and creating that indent. Okay, so that is pressed, and so you just go for it the first time, and then you have to just turn it around and see how it looks, and you might well have to get in there and press it some more. So it's looking pretty good down there. Could do with just a little more pressing there, and maybe just there. so you know I can continue to keep going. So you really are molding something when you're pressing it. So take your time and expect to maybe have to go back in a couple times and do a bit more. Okay, so now that I've pressed my seams out, I'm going to attach the next couple of seams. Now these are 2 straight seams, so I think I will pin both of them. So in this case I've got 2 seams, and I'm going to just go ahead and stitch up both. So I have these 2 now sewn up, and I'll press them open. So I have now completed stitching up the front of the strapless bodice. So it is 3-dimensional now, with we can see it's starting to take shape. This is fairly good to go, and I'm going to do the very same thing now, all the same steps for the lining of the strapless bodice. So that will be done in a different colour, and that's for contrast for the sake of the video, so you can tell the difference. Generally speaking, if you're making a strapless bodice and something like this, you would just probably line it most likely with itself on the inside. So now I've sewn up the outside of the strapless bodice and the lining of the strapless, which is the lighter pink, and I will put them together and sew them along the top and the bottom. But first of all, you would insert boning, so on the inside here at the seams we will create channels and insert the boning. So now I have the outer bodice and the lining of the bodice both completely stitched up, and the casings for the boning completed on the lining, and I'm going to take these 2 and pin them all together along the top and stitch along the top. So now I'm just going to sew along the top of the 2 bodices. So I've sewn along the top line there of the bodice, and this will fold in, and that will be the lining in the lighter pink and the outer bodice in the darker pink. And so what I'll need to do there is some snips on the inside there to release any tension and press that seam open, and then do an under stitch. So now that seam has been pressed open, and I'm going to do an under stitch on it. So the under stitch is taking the seam allowance over onto the under piece, or the lining, or the facing, whatever it is. In this case it's the lighter pink. Pulling the seam allowance over and stitching about 1 millimeter along here, so that it holds the lining piece under and back. So I've got the seam allowance under, place this down, and I'm going to stitch just 1 millimeter to there, and all the time underneath with my hand catching, so that the seam allowance is pulled over. At the same time I pull ever so gently apart, just so that the seam is not producing any tuck. And so that's what that looks like. The understitch is just very close to the edge there, and you'll see that just holds that lining piece back, so it won't stick out from the front. And in this case, with the two different tones of fabrics, it will make a real difference that the different colour fabric won't come over the edge at the front. Okay, so we have stitched the top and understitched, and now we're ready to put the boning in all of the casings. So just a quick note on the boning. I'm using this plastic boning, but a lot of time it comes in rolls and it's very curved. So if that is the case, I have just ironed it out for a little bit to lessen the curve. Now you might not get it all the way out, but just to reduce that intense curve. You can also soak it in a bit of water and lay books and things on top of it if you need it to be really dead straight, and you might want to do that overnight. So I'm going to start inserting them into the casings, and then I can stitch up the bottom of the casings, and then I'll be able to attach the bottom. So now I have the bodice ready to sew up the bottom. I have inserted all of the boning into the casings and sealed it up at the bottom. And so now the last step is to take this bodice, flip it back around inside out, and put it edge to edge. Now it might look like these don't match anymore, but remember we made the lining one a few millimeters shorter, and also we've done this understitch, which sometimes pulls it in a way that makes it look like it doesn't line up. So make the edges line up. Our pattern was correct, and so we lined that up, and this is designed to be slightly shorter, so it will pull the outside fabric around the two edges, and so the lining won't peep out. So all the way along, pin, 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 and stitch, and then we'll turn it through. So this is now pinned all along the edge and ready to stitch all the way along. So this seam is now stitched all the way along the bottom. I'm going to snip to release tension all the way along, and as this seam will fold up, and it needs a little bit, a few snips so that it won't be too tight, and then also snip off any excess seam allowance. And don't be afraid to snip through where there is seam allowance. Sometimes people think for some reason they should avoid that bit, but actually often that's the bit that has the most tension in it. So snip all the way along, and we'll turn it through. It's time to turn this through and check if there are any little tucks or any pulls. We may need to come back in and snip in places more to release more tension. And we won't be able to tell till we come from the outside, and also there could possibly be a little tuck somewhere that we can see, so it's important just to remember that we have to double check first. So it's a little tricky with the boning, and everything gets really creased, so you're hoping really that you only have to do this once. Everything will be fine when it gets turned around, but sometimes it needs to go in and out a couple of times until it is right. You want to be sure, if you have silk and fine fabrics, that you have very clean hands when you're doing this kind of thing. that way. It looks pretty good. I see maybe a tiny bit of tension there. I'm not sure. I'll try it on the mannequin and see. But other than that, it looks really good, and it will need its final press on each edge. And yes, there we have a boned strapless bodice. That's the outside, that's the inside. You can see now the way, because this lining piece was designed a couple of millimeters shorter, you can see the front fabric sort of rolling over on each side. And we won't be able to get to do a understitch on this side because we can't get into it now, but at least if it's done on the top, which is the primary position, and we have reduced the amount of fabric that's in this, in our pattern, it will magically sit like that, which makes a big difference. So even though this is lined with a completely different colour, you don't see it at all.